So most of you are already wise enough to have noticed that we can too often get stuck in patterns of thinking or behavior that don't serve us, right? Maybe it's a voice within ourselves that whispers that I'm not ready yet, or it shows up in this habit of pushing healthier choices in our lives way down to the bottom of our endless to-do lists. I know I can speak for myself. There's a massive to-do list, and sometimes my meditation practice, I really have to consciously put it at the top of that list because it is the sort of source of fulfillment for all the rest of it, the source of kind of motivation and inspiration for all the rest of it. In the tradition of yoga psychology, as you may know, we have this word for these patterns that is called samskaras, right? These imprints of our experience that are cultivated as a result of past action, past experience, past karma, whether in this lifetime or a previous one. But for those who are relatively new to this concept, we can paint a bit of a picture to help imagine it. So if you think of yourself walking through fresh snow, as perhaps many of you have done, unless you have been fortunate enough to live for your entire life in Costa Rica, the first time, right, when you're walking through snow, you create a path. And the second time, you naturally want to follow those same footprints because, the snow on the sides of you tends to build up. So after about the 10th time of walking this path, assuming the snow hasn't melted completely, that path is so deeply carved that it feels impossible to walk any other way. There are 10-foot snow drifts, right, banks on the side of your path. So these, of course, this is an image, sort of childlike image for our samskaras, these grooves of our awareness that we create, right, through repeated thoughts, actions, and experiences. Some of these grooves, of course, serve us well, right? The ability to drive a car without consciously having to think about every move, like we did when we first started driving, or the kind of compassionate instinct that we have to reach out to a friend who is in pain or who's hurting, to be there for a family member when they're going through a tough time. These are also samskaras. So samskaras are ubiquitous. They're inevitable, and they are really a neutral psychological term for how we build habits. And we all have at least some expansive, positive samskaras already. But other ones, right? These are like those ruts that we keep getting entrapped in, that we keep almost like we're circling this same mountain instead of actually being able to make the decision to climb up towards the peak. So when I was preparing this talk with and talking to Irene about sort of this opening talk, she was like, "You should talk a little bit about your own obstacles." So obviously, like everyone else, I have my own negative samskaras. Recently, actually, when she invited me to do this, I was thinking about this very recent experience where I had felt like I had shifted out of this behavior that was something that sort of comes and goes in my life, this behavior that I feel is rooted in my own negative samskaras, um, and that gives rise to certain kind of behavior. But what was ironic, ultimately, when I kind of contemplated and thought about it a little bit more, was it's not so much even that individual behavior that had the most negative impact. It was my reaction to that behavior. It was particularly this profound guilt that I felt about slipping back into this kind of same habituated pattern. And it turned out this reaction was even an even more, it was an experience of even more negative samskara because it was whispering into my ear that I'm somehow not good enough for my own contemplative process. And that, I think, that there has to be some, state of goodness that we have to reach and we have to inhabit at all times in order to be able to show up this way in this life. It reminds me a lot, actually, of when I taught asana, and people would often tell me that they're not flexible enough to do a yoga class. I know you yoga teachers out there know what I'm talking about. You've probably heard your students come to you say, um, I can't do yoga. I'm so inflexible. I can't even touch my toes, right? As if there's this prerequisite of being particularly flexible in order to even show up in a yoga class. And people would ask, well, how do I get flexible so so I can be better in this class? Right. It's kind of this dumbfounding question that we hear as yoga teachers because we all know that, right? The answer is you just keep coming to class. Everyone is where they're at, and every stage of flexibility or lack thereof is a perfectly appropriate place from which to begin. So in a somewhat similar way with regards to the process of deep sadhana, right? And with regards to pursuing study and aligning and choosing, adopting and adapting to some form of spiritual technology, one of the most common negative samskaras, especially for me, is that, I need to tick this box of some checklist of what makes a good yogic person before I can be serious about my sadhana. And I think we are fed this idea pervasively throughout the spiritual world, right? In the yoga and spiritual community, that one of these kind of toxic remarks, in my opinion, that we hear again and again is, or we see happening, or we witness either done to us, or perhaps we've done it to other people, is when someone highlights a thought or behavior in you or someone else and says something to the effect of, well, that's not very yogic or spiritual of you. Perhaps you should think about it in a more yogic way. Perhaps some of you heard this before. So not only is that samskara of not being good enough one that we repeat to ourselves in so many different ways, it's also one that we also are regurgitating back to each other in all of these subtle and not so subtle ways, in the way that we kind of police the categories of what counts as a spiritual experience. And I think that this distinction between what is yogic or spiritual and what is unyogic or unspiritual is itself a very negative samskara that categorizes certain things as a part of our spiritual journey and other things as sort of necessarily on the outside of it. But from the tantric perspective, that is kind of the philosophical orientation that we're inhabiting throughout sadhana school, there is nothing outside our spirituality, because every aspect of our life is an aspect of this contemplative process. So, and the reason we don't see it as such, right, according to this tantric yoga tradition, is that we are in this kind of state of ignorance with regards to how everything is actually a part of that contemplative process. If we only had the ability or the opportunity to refine our knowledge systems and to engage in those practices that cultivate our nervous system in such a way that we can recognize the truth of that, right? The truth that everything is part and parcel of this kind of contemplative adventure. So one of the reactions to that, understandable ones, or kind of concerns, right, is that, well, if everything is a part of the spiritual path, then what motivates me to move beyond my anger and resentment towards this or that, right? By affirming that everything in life is a part of my own contemplative process, isn't that kind of like an apology for injustice or a justification for sticking with the status quo, right? If everything is divine, then what is the anchor for morality, right? What actually motivates an ethical disposition in life? And I think that this actually is a misunderstanding, right? That we also find when a lot of people understandably want to play devil's advocate with what we call kind of these non-dual perspectives, right? Where, because non-dual can't negate everything, it has to embrace everything. And if it embraces everything, then we seem to run into these contradictions of, well, how do I embrace, the horrible aspects of life? But um, the tradition, I think, says that by situating our experience of limitation or ignorance, by situating our understanding of what we would otherwise perceive to be the evils of the world, or the things that we understandably want to change and transform for ourselves and also for our communities or for our global community, when we situate all of that within a larger context of yogic knowledge and practice, we actually transform those negative experiences into fuel for deeper insight. So as a result, we can actually become more skillful and more imaginative about how to create the conditions in our personal and our collective lives for greater fulfillment and for a sense of more meaningfulness. And that also, of course, translates into greater insight about how to respond to the negative circumstances of the world. So by contrast with this view that by embracing everything as divine, we are somehow apologizing or justifying the negative circumstances of the world, it's actually quite the opposite. We become more skillful with regards to those things. We become activists, but in a contemplative way. And that's another thing that throughout the year of sadhana school, and really even if you just did the fall sadhana, this is something that we tarry with, we grapple with again and again as we study the traditions of yoga, study the philosophies that the tradition is rooted in. So, in that spirit of Ganesha, right, in spirit of Ganapati, the elephant-headed deity, the Lord of obstacles, as he would say, every obstacle is an opportunity. So, the thing about negative samskaras, right, is that, or another thing about them is that they can also feel so familiar that they feel like home, right? They feel they're what's comfortable for us because even though a home may be dysfunctional, it still feels better than the alternative, right? Which is sort of the unknown. That samskara or that groove of kind of not being good enough, not being yogic enough, for example, right? There are, of course, many others, starts to feel so familiar that it feels like home. And, but of course, as we know, right, as many of us as adults have experienced, homes are something that we outgrow or can outgrow. So there's two responses, I think, to this idea of outgrowing the home that we find in the yoga tradition. We can either leave it behind, right? We can leave our home behind. We can build new additions to the home. We can build new wings of our house. So the former, we might say, is the renunciatory approach, right? The renunciatory approach says, I need to get out of this, meat tube of piss and shit. I need to negate the circumstances of the material world to transcend to some place beyond the world. This is sort of, tantamount to leaving our home behind for, I don't know, a cave or a hermitage somewhere. So that if that's the renunciatory approach, then the other approach we find in the tradition that some of you know very well who've studied with me before is this householder approach. This approach that I've been thinking about in this kind of with this sort of metaphor of rather than leaving the house behind, we're actually building new additions to the house. We're building new rooms of the house. So rather than needing to act directly against the samskaras, we are bringing into being new modes of perception, new rooms within our own awareness, within which we can within which we can inhabit and derive a sense of inspiration and meaningfulness. So, in doing that, in order to do that, we have to cultivate samskaras that are aligned with it. And the yoga philosophy, study, and practice is what is oriented around that. So these samskaras, right, these positive samskaras, these are called nirodha samskaras. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this term, um, chittavritti nirodha, right? Yoga's chittavritti nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. So the nirodha is those samskaras that are kind of liberation samskaras. They're samskaras that rather than orienting us toward habituated modes of contraction, or negative mindsets or limiting beliefs about ourselves are these samskaras that actually point us toward a more expansive disposition, a more liberated mindset about what's possible in this life. And by cultivating those nirodha samskaras through study and practice, through swadhyaya, through self-study, the negative samskaras begin to have less power over us. We begin to see that the room, right, that symbolizes the negative samskara is simply an option within us. And we begin to be able to inhabit this ledge of freedom that lets us actually have some kind of radical choice between which room we inhabit within ourselves. So the yoga tradition is offering us really something or many things that are incredibly remarkable. They're offering us multiple technologies of transformation. And in the sadhana school, especially the first term, we are embracing yoga as through this definition of liberation. And so the point of yoga, insofar as there is a definition of it, is that the definition is the process, the state of liberation, which is conceived differently by different traditions, and the technologies that actually cultivate the possibility of that liberation. But what holds them all together in their diversity is this impulse towards liberation, is this ability to cultivate a state of jivan mukti, of liberation in this lifetime. So that's what Sadhana School is ultimately offering. It's not just about information, right? There's lots of, courses you can take where you're getting information, where you're studying something objectively, and we will do that. We'll have a very kind of scholarly, intellectual approach to all of this, but we're also equally interested in transformation, not information, but transformation. And the transformation happens through a synergistic exploration of knowledge and experience. The knowledge that has been passed down through the texts of the tradition, and then the spiritual technologies that actually allow us to embody that knowledge within ourselves. So through this initial 8 weeks, right, that we're exploring starting next Tuesday with an orientation on Saturday, we're going to be studying the philosophical traditions of yoga that help us to contextualize our own contemplative practices, and to really situate, and to use this beautiful term that I stole from Irene, to provide a scaffolding of knowledge by means of which we can actually contextualize and make meaningful the variable frequencies, tones, and textures of our own contemplative experience. We're also going to learn about different practices, right? As I said, that help us to forge these new liberating grooves. And you'll get to experiment with different ones. And that's kind of what the whole first term is about, exposing you to a whole breadth of subtle practices. Not for at least this term, we're not studying any physical postures for those of you who are like, I don't want to do hatha yoga anyway. There will be an opportunity for that, but that's a kind of separate add-on process that's a part of the whole yoga teacher training. And some of you are already enrolled in that, I know. So we'll be exploring the hatha yoga element in that part that starts in January. But for this first term, and indeed for all of the sadhanas throughout the year, our emphasis is on subtle practices and really deep philosophical inquiry. And then, right, another thing that's really important to me and has been an ongoing development, something that we kind of try and then kind of fall away from, and I have some thoughts on why it's been hard to maintain that I won't get into for today, but we really want to build a kula, sustain a community of individuals, not that are just, together because, they like each other's personality, although that may be a natural byproduct. But a kula is not just any community. It's a one that is bonded by a shared commitment to sadhana. That's really what the tradition is talking about when it's talking about a kula or a sangha. It's not just kind of a general collection of people brought together by spiritual aims, but by a kind of shared commitment to sadhana, and also by spiritual aims, I suppose. All right, so we're going to start now to move into this exercise. And I'd like for all of us to begin just to take a moment. You can close your eyes for a second and just do a little body scan, mental scan, and notice what kind of mood has arisen for you. Or perhaps there's a kind of familiar pull of resistance. Perhaps a sense of like, what is this guy talking about? The sense of limitation. Or this sense that it's not for me. And in recognizing and just observing, add a little label to each one of those things that it's all good, it's all normal. It's your existing samskāras doing what they do. And then recognizing these feelings of resistance or limitation, if they exist. Try to locate also that movement within you that is encouraging you toward a greater depth of experience. Indeed, it's probably the same movement that caused you to sign up for this today. What does that feel like? What's the texture of that? So closing your eyes and just staying with that spark for a moment, that subtle movement. You might even say it's a mudra, right? A mudra is not just a physical hand posture, it's also a gesture of consciousness that you can inhabit, right? It's like that room that we were talking about that we create. We create mudras within that we inhabit, these states of consciousness. One very famous one, the Kechari mudra, right? Which has a physical hatha yoga counterpart as this kind of funny mudra where you cut the base of your tongue and stick your tongue to the top of your throat and trigger your nectar. But it also has an esoteric, symbolic meaning in the tantric tradition as flying in the space of consciousness, flying in the space of consciousness, this internal gesture that we can cultivate through practice. So the yogic sages, the teachers, the scholar practitioners, they left us a lot of tools, tools that are both conceptual and practical. So we have this notion of vairagya or non-attachment, which is this attitude or disposition that we can cultivate with regards to our negative samskaras, which doesn't mean detachment. It's a slightly different, subtly different disposition or attitude that we'll explore more. And then we have this principle of abhyasa, right? This principle of a repeated, sustained commitment to a sequence of practice. And it is that sequence of practice that helps us to cultivate these nirodha samskaras. But we can't do that without a process of swadhyaya, right? This process of swadhyaya, which is the study of the knowledge systems. It's actually the study of the self through the study of the ancient sacred yoga texts. Because, right, we need the knowledge, right? We need the code, right? You can think about it in terms of an iPhone, right? There's code that and a knowledge system that had to be developed in order to then manifest and create that physical reality that is the iPhone. And our consciousness we can think of as somewhat like this, right? If we don't have the ideas, if we're not able to cultivate the imagination around what's possible for ourselves, then our practices are just going to take us toward the same limiting ideas we have. So we need both. We need knowledge and we need practice. So we sustain this process, right? This process of abhyasa, swadhyaya, and vairagya. We sustain it not through some lonely, self-involved, navel-gazing process, um, this common sort of characterization, right, of the yogi or the meditator. But as householders, as affirmers of life, we engage in this process in a community of practitioners or a kula, or what's sometimes called a sangha, especially in the Buddhist tradition. So through the elements of our spiritual technology, we can begin to realize and bring into being different possibilities for our life, different patterns, liberative patterns that are in service not only for ourselves, but for each other. And by bringing this into being through these new affirmative, nirodha, liberative samskaras, the negative ones, hopefully over time, slowly, gradually, begin to have less power over us as we begin to be able to inhabit these other rooms of our awareness more easily. I am going to send you all, look out for an email. There will be a coupon code in that for those of you who are not enrolled, that will give you a sort of special opportunity to enroll in Sadhana school below the listed price, and as a thank you for showing up today and enrolling in this Q&A. So let's go ahead and take a moment just to close our eyes. A lot of information. And there's definitely a lot of information today and also in the forthcoming weeks that you'll be invited to interact with and engage with. but always coming back to this recollection, this recognition, this recognition, right? This idea that we've known this before. This is actually something, the wisdom of which we already have inside us. And it's there to be uncovered. It's not anything different from who we are. It's not some sort of alien grabbing of some exotic state. It is actually the default state of our experience according to the tradition. There's actually these various personas of contraction that are actually the exception to that truth of ourselves. And so as we engage with deep knowledge and explore philosophical study, for me, it's always important to kind of return to this recollection that this is about a kind of process of remembering. And so we ask ourselves again and again, as I engage with this material, is my relationship with it such that it is contracting me, that it's making me feel limited, right? We can take any knowledge system and turn it into a reason to feel shitty about ourselves. And the way in which we cultivate the condition to engage with the knowledge in a more fruitful and expansive way is by staying anchored in our sadhana. It allows us to read and interpret and understand the knowledge in that way that leads us toward that expansive disposition, that subtler range of perception